It's the greatest generation versus the most powerful military force of the 21st century. The soldiers who showed Adolf Hitler and the rest of them fascists their place versus the troops who might be trying to do the same to Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and the rest of the world's anti-West forces in the next few years. But who would win in a battle between the two? That's the question we aim to answer in this video, as we take the United States military as it stood in 1941 and stack it up against the U.S. Army of today to determine an ultimate victor. And we'll start where any Army comparison should start: pure numbers. According to Global Firepower, 2024's U.S. military has an estimated 2,127,500 members. That's split into active and reserve troops, with a little over 1.3 million actively serving today versus 799,500 waiting in the wings, ready to be called up at a moment's notice. But we immediately start to see the 2024 numbers get a little confusing. According to Global Firepower, 1,403,200 members of America's military are part of its army. Naturally, that would lead you to conclude that the 724,300 are split between the Navy and the Air Force, right? That would make sense, only the numbers Global Firepower shares suggest that the U.S. Air Force has 701,000 members in 2024 and the Navy has 667,108. Something doesn't add up. We need to look into other resources to see if that 1.4 million number for the Army is anywhere close to accurate. And frankly, it isn't. According to Statista, the Army of 2022, the period for which it has the most recent figures, actually had 461,657 active members. That is slightly disputed by the Army's own active component demographics, which claims 463,083 for the same period. With these two sources, we're quibbling over a couple of thousand people, so we can say that the U.S. Army currently has somewhere in the region of 460,000 active personnel. It's certainly not 1.4 million, meaning we can only presume that Global Firepower is adding both reserves and non-military personnel that happen to be working alongside the Army. But do you know who does have 1.4 million members? The United States Army of 1941, or more accurately, 1,462,315 members, according to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. 1941 brought a massive ramping up of America's Army as it geared up for its eventual entry into the world's largest ever theater of war. In that previous year, the U.S. Army had numbered just 269,000 members, but by December 1941, the month in which the U.S. finally entered the conflict, the 1 million active personnel barrier had been well and truly broken. What gives? In a word, the draft. On September 16, 1940, the U.S. created its Selective Training and Service Act, which required all fit men between the ages of 21 and 45 to register for the draft. Not every man who registered would go to war. The U.S. used a draft lottery system, with each person chosen required to serve for at least a year, though this was extended several times during the war. But the U.S. made quick work of this draft to bolster its army to the point where it was the largest it had ever been. And it didn't stop there. By 1945, the U.S. Army had a staggering 8.2 million members. Still, we're talking about 1941 here, and when it comes to pure numbers of boots on the ground, the 1941 version of the U.S. Army absolutely dominates the Army of 2024. Now, what if we take the numbers game to the seas? By 1941, the United States Navy had expanded from 160,997 members to 284,427. It's not quite the massive growth we saw in the Army, but the draft clearly affected the numbers here. An extra 120,000 Navy personnel in just 1 year represented a near doubling of America's naval forces as it geared up to fight the Axis powers, specifically Japan. As with the Army figures we have for 2024, the Navy figures vary depending on the source. Global Firepower says the Navy has 667,108 members, which appears to include reservists and people who may work with the Navy but aren't going to be deployed if a war starts. Moving over to Statista, the numbers look very different. By the end of 2024, it's anticipated the U.S. Navy will have around 347,000 personnel, including 32 vice admirals and 10 admirals. That would represent slight growth over the last few years. Statista says the Navy had about 343,000 members in 2021 and 340,000 in 2022, but the organization has been relatively stable for over a decade. Still, these numbers give the Navy of 2024 the advantage regarding sheer personnel numbers. And that makes sense when you consider the Navy now has far more complex assets than it had in 1941. More people are needed to staff larger and more complex aircraft carriers, submarines, and ships. It's also worth pointing out that the Navy of 1941 had more ships at its disposal than the Navy of 2024. According to Naval History and Heritage Command, the 1941 Navy's active ship force levels covered an astonishing 790 vessels. And that was just the start. By World War II's end, that number had ballooned to 6,768. By contrast, the Navy of 2024 is believed to have around 470 assets, a term that covers everything from aircraft carriers and submarines to destroyers and corvettes. So it's something of a dead heat. The Navy of 2024 has more members, but the one from 1941 has more ships. On pure numbers, the war in the seas would be a lock. Of course, this doesn't account for the impact of more modern equipment on the 2024 military, but we'll get to that later. Next up, a form of warfare still in its pretty early stages in 1941, the aerial battle. Unlike with the other categories, the National World War II Museum doesn't provide any membership numbers for the U.S. Air Force in 1941. There's a good reason for this. Air Force numbers may have been rolled into Army numbers. According to the Air Force Historical Research Agency, or AFHRA, November 1940 saw the removal of the Chief of the Air Corps jurisdiction over the General Headquarters of the Air Force. That headquarters was instead given a separate status and fell under the control of the Commander of the Army Field Forces. About 7 months later, George C. Marshall created the Army Air Forces, or AAF, which was an organization that would oversee both the Air Corps and the Air Force Combat Command, the newly rebranded former headquarters. So, it all gets just a little complicated. The AAF was a separate entity in many respects. By June 1941, it was back under the control of aerial leaders rather than the commander of the Army Field Forces. But note the use of the word Army in the AAF's name. It was still technically classed as part of the U.S. Army. Thus, we have the likely reason why our museum figures don't mention the AAF, and that creates some complications. If the AAF's numbers are rolled into the Army numbers, then the 1941 military ground numbers aren't quite as strong as they first appear. To determine how much weaker that military branch is, we must discover how many people were in the AAF in 1941. The numbers vary depending on the source. According to Wikipedia, the AAF numbered at 354,161 personnel in December 1941, which covers everybody from general enlistees to officers and those stationed overseas. However, a paper published by Maxwell Air University claims the AAF recruits about 21,000 people in that same period. We have to ask the same question we asked earlier when talking about ground forces. What gives? The figures aren't made much clearer by the AFHRA. It claims that the U.S. Army's Air Force numbered at 26,500 in 1939 and had rocketed up to 2.253 million by 1945. However, it does not mention how that growth occurred in the interim, meaning it doesn't say how many members the AAF had in 1941. However, the AFHRA's figures do roughly align with those on Wikipedia. It claims 2,253,182 members in August 1945, so we'll accept the 354,161 returned by the source as our numbers for the AAF in 1941. Let's do a little more math before moving on to 2024's Air Force. Earlier in the video, we told you that the U.S. Army had 1,462,315 members in 1941. However, the AAF's members were likely counted amongst those numbers, given that it was a branch of the Army at the time. So the reality is that the U.S. Army actually had 1,107,974 members on the ground, still more than double the Army size in 2024. With that out of the way, let's dig into the size of the U.S. Air Force in 2024. Global Firepower claims there are 701,319 U.S. Air Force personnel in 2024. Again, that seems high and likely counts reservists and people who may serve in the Air Force in some way but aren't actively a part of it. Perhaps a more accurate number comes from the Air Force Times, which wrote a report in December 2023, stating that the U.S. Air Force has plans to trim its numbers in 2024. It says that the service aims to ramp up to 502,700 enlisted members by the end of the year, covering active duty members, Air Force Reserves, and Air National Guard. Whichever way you slice it, the 2024 Air Force seems to have the advantage over the 1941 Air Force by anywhere from 150,000 to nearly 350,000 members, a clear manpower victory for the 2024 aerial aces. Where does all of this number crunching leave us in terms of sheer manpower? Clearly, the 1941 version of the U.S. military had many more boots on the ground. With over 1.1 million members, the U.S. Army of that time was more than double the size of the 2024 Army, suggesting that it could overwhelm its future version on the ground. But the AAF is far from hitting the numbers of the 2024's U.S. Air Force, while the Navy seems to fall in favor of the 2024 U.S. Navy, simply because, while the 1941 version had more ships, it doesn't mean it had better ships. And that takes us to our next category of comparison. While the numbers are always important, it's the quality and nature of equipment that will ultimately determine the outcome of the battle. And, spoiler alert, the 2024 military comes out on top every time. That should not come as any surprise, given that it benefits from 83 years of military advancement over its 1941 counterpart. But it's still worth looking into some of the differences in equipment to see how they could negate the manpower question. We could spend hours covering this topic. Practically nothing that was used in 1941 is still part of the U.S. military of 2024. So we're going to look at a handful of arms and equipment to see how they stack up. And that starts with the one thing that every member of the U.S. Army receives upon signing up: their service rifle. In 1941, that rifle was the M1 Garand. Entering service in 1937, the M1 Garand is often thought of as the first self-loading rifle to enter the theater of war. But that is not technically correct. The Lebel Model 1886 bolt-action rifle was the first to feature a self-contained cartridge, and several other self-loaders came along before the M1 Garand. However, we can undoubtedly claim that the Garand was the rifle that both popularized self-loading and proved that it could be used reliably in conflicts. Weighing 11.24 pounds when fully loaded, the M1 Garand could fire up to 24 rounds per minute in the hands of a skilled shooter and had a magazine capacity of 8 rounds. It had a solid range too, with its effective firing range being just a smidge under 500 yards. The rifle gave American troops a clear advantage in World War II, leading to General George S. Patton's famous quote, "In my opinion, the M1 Garand is the greatest battle implement ever devised," holding true in the eyes of many in World War II who were stuck with bolt-action rifles they had to manually cycle around into after every shot. But let's face it, the M1 Garand does not stack up to the M4 carbine. Though it looks like it's to be replaced by the XM7 during 2024, the M4 carbine is still the standard service rifle for most of the 2024 military at the time of this video's creation. In service since 1994, the rifle fires the 5.56 by 45 mm rounds accurately on target at a rate of up to 100 per minute, over 4 times the output of the M1 Garand. It's much lighter too, weighing just 5.5 pounds when unloaded. But interestingly, it does fall short of the M1 Garand in one category. Its effective firing range is about half that of the Garand. Still, it makes up for that by being a selective fire weapon capable of going both semi or fully automatic. So even though the Garand might have a range advantage, the carbine will register more hits in close quarters. Add a 30-round magazine and you have a far superior rifle. The 2024 military easily wins this battle, though the M1 is not without its uses. It could help a 1941 soldier pick off an individual or two from range before the M4 carbine becomes effective, but that minor advantage is not enough in this battle. Let's move on to planes, specifically fighters. In 1941, the fighter of choice was the Curtiss P-40E Warhawk, or the P-40 for short. It was the main fighter that engaged the Japanese combatants at the bombing of Pearl Harbor, with the U.S. deploying it to the Philippines when it entered the war in December 1941. A year later, the P-40 was the fighter teaming up with China's famous Flying Tigers, and it was an impressive piece of machinery. The craft was known for being one of the more rugged in World War II, with the durability making up for the fact that it was often less maneuverable than its contemporaries. The Allison V1710 engine allowed it to reach a maximum speed of 362 miles per hour, and it could fly for about 850 miles. In terms of armaments, the P-40 had 6 50-caliber machine guns to slice through enemies and opposing craft, in addition to being equipped with facilities that would allow it to drop 700 pounds of bombs onto land-based targets. It was reasonably compact, too, with a wingspan of just 37 feet 4 inches. All very impressive for 1941, but it's not even close to what the U.S. Air Force of 2024 has in its arsenal. Though the F-35 is slowly phasing it out, The F-16 is still the fighter of choice for most of the U.S. Air Force, and to the surprise of nobody, it beats the P-40 in practically every category. First deployed in 2002, the F-16 has a 31-foot wingspan, making it over 6 feet narrower than the P-40. It also has far more options in aerial combat. Along with its M61A1 Vulcan Gatling gun, which fires 20mm rounds, the F-16 can be equipped with an array of missiles. The AGM-65 Maverick takes care of targets on the ground, with the AGM-84 Harpoon tackling naval threats. As for a dogfight with a P-40, the AIM-9 Sidewinder missile would take that P-40 out at short range, with the AIM-7 Sparrow handling the medium-range game, and the AIM-120 AMRAAM eliminating P-40s at a distance. All guided missiles would easily shoot P-40s out of the sky before they could get close enough to use their machine guns. Still, maybe the P-40 could fly away, right? Absolutely no chance. The F-16's 1,260-mile range means it will win a battle of attrition. And even if a P-40 pilot does a 180 to turn tail and flee, the F-16 can reach 1,319 miles per hour, over 4 times more than the top speed of the P-40. You could put the best pilot that 1941's military has in a P-40, and they would be shot down by practically any pilot in the U.S. Air Force in 2024. Let's move on to the U.S. Navy. According to the retired U.S. Navy Captain Sam Tengredi, in naval warfare, a smaller fleet of superior quality ships is not a way to victory. The side with the most ships almost always wins. If we're to take that quote at face value, that would mean that 1941's Navy beats 2024's. It has around 300 more ships after all. But context is key. Captain Tengredi was talking about a comparison between contemporary naval forces. For instance, China's Navy surpassed America's fleet size in 2020, giving it a clear advantage if those two countries were to go to war in 2024. But if you were to stack the U.S. Navy of 2024 against 1941, the gulf in technology is so massive, it would not matter that the 1941 Navy has more ships. They simply could not compete with what the U.S. of 2024 has at its disposal. The U.S. Navy of 1941 also had another problem. A huge portion of its fleet of battleships was crippled at the Pearl Harbor attacks. For this reason, the U.S. focused on using aircraft carriers and submarines to fight against Japan, at least while it was rebuilding. So let's make subs our final point of equipment focus. For the Navy of 1941, that would be the Gato-class sub, the first submarines that America mass-produced for World War II. Gato classes were diesel-electric-powered subs that measured 311 feet and could hold up to 60 crew members. It could also reach a top speed of 24 miles per hour on the surface. They were also some of World War II's most heavily armed submarines. Each standard Gato-class sub came with a 40mm anti-aircraft cannon, a 20mm cannon, and a deck cannon that fired either 76 or 127mm rounds. Once it was underwater, the Gato had 10 433mm torpedo tubes, 4 in its aft and 6 in its fore. That typically fired Mark 10 and Mark 14 torpedoes. Though sometimes problematic regarding accuracy and reliability, the latter weighed about 3,000 pounds and could travel for 4,500 yards. As for radar, there was not much to speak of. Radar was very much in its infancy in 1941, with the U.S. only developing prototype SJ radar systems in December 1941, so we can safely assume that most subs of 1941 simply didn't have much, if any, access to radar. Fine for fighting against Japanese subs that were also light on their use of radar. But when it comes to battling the submarines of 2024, the Gato class has a huge battle on its hands. In 2024, the U.S. Navy has 3 classes of nuclear-powered SSN submarines in service, with Submarine Force Pacific claiming the Los Angeles class is the backbone of the entire fleet. 40 of these submarines are in operation today, so let's see how that sub stacks up against the Gato class. The Los Angeles class is a little faster, hitting top speeds of over 28 miles per hour, but not so fast that it has a massive advantage over the Gato class. It's also about 60 feet longer, which you could argue would make it easier to spot, but that extra size is put to good use as the submarine has a crew of 143 people. More worrying for the Gato class is the superiority of the Los Angeles class sub's armaments. Though it has only 4 torpedo tubes, the sub fires the Mark 48 torpedo, capable of carrying a 650-pound warhead. These torpedoes can travel for about 10,000 yards, more than double the range of the Mark 10 in the Gato class. Add to this the Tomahawk cruise missiles that allow the Los Angeles class to attack land targets, as well as advanced radar and sonar systems that would make it far easier for the Los Angeles to detect the Gato than vice versa. And 2024 is again a clear winner. Frankly, the Los Angeles class would usually be able to sink the Gato before the crew even knew the Los Angeles was in the vicinity. We've looked at 3 military assets here. The reality is, no matter where you look, the U.S. military of 2024 will always be better equipped than that of 1941, simply because over 80 years of technological advancement. It's an unfair fight that completely eliminates any slight advantage the 1941 military has in sheer numbers. And all of this leaves us with one more area of comparison: nuclear weapons. It seems as if we're throwing salt into the 1941 military's wounds here, and we are. But you also can't deny the fact that the 2024 military would always have had the nuclear option to deploy should it somehow start losing a fight against the 1941 version. In 1941, the very concept of a nuclear weapon was still in its infancy. Franklin D. Roosevelt only approved the development of the first atomic bomb in October 1941, with the U.S. Department of Defense claiming that approval came in part because he feared Germany might create one first. It wasn't until July 16, 1945, that the first successful nuclear test occurred, with America going on to drop their newly developed weapon on Hiroshima and Nagasaki the next month, effectively ending World War II. Still, the 1941 version of the U.S. military had no access to nukes. As for the 2024 version, the Arms Control Association says that it has 5,244 nuclear weapons, though only 1,549 of them are strategically deployed. Regardless, that's still 1,549 more nukes than the 1941 military had, with America also having the ability to launch them from submarines, drop them from planes, and fire them off from land using intercontinental ballistic missiles. So our comparison between the 1941 U.S. military and the modern-day version is complete, and unsurprisingly, the 2024 version comes out on top in every aspect outside of sheer manpower on the ground. Is anyone really surprised by that? Now check out Most Powerful Military in 2024 Ranked, or watch this instead.